Irashaimase. Hello and welcome to Fitaurus Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fitaurus. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday. And on the menu this Saturday, we have Panzer Dragoon, the 1995 Sega Saturn classic. What kind of taste does it have? Let's get cooking and find out. So Panzer Dragoon came out in early 1995 on the Sega Saturn. It was one of the earliest Sega Saturn titles, so that colors a little bit of the visual presentation the game has. Over the years, Sega would port it to several other platforms. In 1997, it received a Windows port. In 2002 and 2003, depending on which region you're talking about, it was ported to the Xbox as part of Panzer Dragoon Orta. And then in 2006 it would receive its last port to the PlayStation 2 as part of the Sega Ages 2500 collection, volume 27 I believe. So this is the version that we're playing today is the PC port on Panzer Dragoon Orta. So we'll go ahead and fire up normal game. Here we don't even really have any options available. We can change our Y-axis from normal to reverse. Reverse is definitely better in my personal opinion, but you're totally welcome to have your own on that. There were options on the Saturn version, but I think they just had to relate to the sound itself. And exit will just take us back to Panzer Dragoon Orta. So jumping into normal game, we have some of the FMV cutscenes that were available in like glorious, like pixelated, compressed Saturn vision. We'll skip past that for the moment. And here we have Episode 1. So Panzer Dragoon is, in so many ways, like the epitome of the rail shooter. So we're locked into this corridor that we can fly around by moving our reticule, and the dragon follows that reticule. In terms of weaponry, we have a shot that we can fire in rapid fire if we tap the button, or we can hold it down and we get this awesome lock-on shot. I can't remember the number of lock-ons, I believe it's around 6 or 7. Once we have our lock-ons, we release the button and it fires a powerful laser that will deal heavy damage. The other things that we have control-wise, we have the ability to turn ourselves in 360 degrees around our dragon. The only problem that you have with that is once you're facing a direction other than front, you have no ability to dodge. It's solely, more of a first-person view, really. And that brings in some of the challenge that we have with Panzer Dragoon, where you have enemies coming from you from all sides. You have to be careful about when to use a different perspective and when to be facing forward to fire and attack your enemies. It is possible to shoot down a lot of the enemy shots, so that's part of the challenge. It's not like they haven't made it unfair, just trickier. So one way I have seen the game described is a light gun shooter without a light gun, and that's not a bad way to view the title, though you have significantly more control over your movement than that. That's something to keep in mind. In future versions of Panzer Dragoon, you would get additional abilities, as it were. It's kind of neat. We can actually lock on through the buildings and take out enemies that way. In Panzer Dragoon Zwei, I'm sorry, German's not my forte. They would add the ability to build up a charge shot, rather, or, well, maybe, what would be the best way to put it? Hyper mode, where you could charge up a hyper meter, and once you had that meter charged up, you could unleash a devastating attack on your enemies. Then in Panzer Dragoon Orta, you would have like several more abilities. You'd have the ability to dash, the ability to brake, and the ability to change the form of your dragon from like normal to heavy to like glide, which is like a kind of a speed build. It was really neat, and I think I'll get around to covering those ones at some point in the future. So as far as the gameplay is concerned, we go through these corridors. In this section, we happen to come into this building, and we come into this dead end. But it's not a dead end for long, as this battleship happens to have rained down some terror on us, trying to flush us out. It worked, and now we're in like this battle with these iconic battleships from the Panzer Dragoon series. So, a little bit about the history of Panzer Dragoon. So we're in a post-apocalyptic world with these genetic beasts being a lot of what we've been facing are these bioengineered genetic beasts that humanity created years and years ago, and partially led to the downfall of humanity. So fast forward thousands of years from the fall of what the game refers to as the Ancients, and we have a time where some elements of humanity have rediscovered the technology of the Ancients, specifically the Empire. And they have used that technology rather than help the benefit of all humanity. They've used it to oppress humanity. And that's this battleship is part of the Empire. So we're largely through with this fight, but unfortunately towards the end we have this section where we can't damage the ship itself. It has to fire off these 3 missile torpedoes at us, and then we can finally deal the finishing blow to this battleship, ending episode 1. So with the 3 missiles fired, let's finish this off with a good lock-on shot. Maybe? There we go. Just had to hit the right spot on the ship. That is episode 1 of Panzer Dragoon. So we will get a brief stage summary after admiring the beauty of the Blue Dragon. And based off our shot down ratio, we'll get additional credits, or basically lives, as there aren't any lives. If you actually die, you have to start the episode you're on again with a continue. We do get a cutscene. So one thing that's really awesome about Panzer Dragoon is throughout the course of the Panzer Dragoons, they're speaking this different language that has been dubbed Panzerese. One of the creators of the game was a huge language file and created this language that's an amalgamation of ancient Greek, Latin, and Russian. And when you hear what's being spoken in the game itself, that's what it is. Episode 2. Now we're flying over this desert. And a lot of the world's been rendered a desert. We'll take a quick second to look at some of the opening cutscene, just kind of explaining what's going on. So, initially, the character that we are is out hunting some of these mutant beasts with his hunting pals, and happens to come across this ancient cave with all this ancient technology in it. He gets attacked by this walker creature that goes and takes out his mount, but is ultimately saved by the Blue Dragon and its rider, who happens to be fighting the Black Dragon at the time. The Black Dragon, or rather the Blue Dragon, ends up, like, things don't go so well for the Blue Dragon rider. He takes a fatal hit, and the Black Dragon rides off. The Blue Dragon rider then comes up to our hero and, like, passes off his mission to our hero so that he can continue it for him and make sure, basically, that the Black Dragon doesn't reach this tower. Otherwise, I'm not sure what would happen if that was the case. Just that it would be bad for humanity, the resistance. I'm not really sure how you want to parse that. And that's the basic story of how we get to where we are in Panzer Dragoon. Just this relatively fledgling dragon rider taking on this mission from this fallen rider, knight, however you want to go and view it. And really, that's about it. So it's several episodes long. I can't remember the exact number of episodes, but I believe 8. So the game is on the short side, but it has reasonable difficulty if you've never played it before. It's one of those games where you have to play it multiple times, kind of to memorize where the enemies are coming at and how best to handle the situations you encounter. But overall, and that kind of counts towards some of the minus flavors of the game. Also, being an early Saturn game, especially the versions that don't have updated graphics, the PlayStation version ultimately is the best looking, but it has some quirks of its own. And we're getting shot by this worm. Ow. But overall, the graphics are always at least a little dated with Panzer Dragoon. And it's one of the issues with it. Another is controls, a little quirky, given the fact that the Saturn, at least at the time of Panzer Dragoon's release, did not have analog controls of any sort. So we were just locked into having digital controls, and even in the future releases that did have analog control, like this version I am playing, the Xbox version on Panzer Dragoon Orta, where you do have an analog stick, it's still just an approximation of analog and not true analog. And then there's just sometimes the unfairness that we'll get with the enemies and the enemy formations is coming at us in ways that are unfair and ultimately lead to us taking heavy damage. That said, there are definitely some great plus flavors here. For one thing, the soundtrack is truly amazing. There's really some awesome tracks throughout the course of the game itself. Here we find ourselves in combat with that black dragon. Getting back to the other plus flavors, there's also the world building. This futuristic world where people speak in different languages and we're fighting these bio-engineered terrors is really interesting to me. The architecture and the shapes that they decided to use, I wonder if some of it was dictated by the power of the Saturn at the time, but it really invokes this different society of these ancients that we're following in their footsteps of and using their technology. And then there's this, admittedly, for me personally at least, there's a nostalgia that exists in regards to Panzer Dragoon, as the title itself was one of the earliest Saturn games, and if you were a fan of the Saturn at all, it likely has a special place in your heart. It would go and see several awesome follow-ups. The Panzer Dragoon's Vi would come out a few years later and was a truly excellent game, and then you would get the really unique hybrid shooting RPG Panzer Dragoon Saga. Unfortunately, both those titles would remain Sega Saturn exclusives and never were ported to another system. So especially Panzer Dragoon Saga isn't the easiest to come by, and Saturn emulation is finicky at best. So they're not easy games to acquire or play in this day, but it might be worth seeking them out one way or another. And then there was the really awesome Panzer Dragoon Orta that came out on the Xbox, and that one, since the system did have some graphical power, it looks great, and it really does play well as well, especially with some of the new mechanics that it added in. And bam, Black Dragon down. Well, there we have it. That's Panzer Dragoon, served up for your enjoyment. If you're a fan of rail shooters or older Sega classics, it's definitely one I recommend giving a try, or at least, definitely giving a try and seeking out in one form or another. Well, that'll wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for coming out and joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.